It was 11:42 a.m., November 29, 1943, 24,000 feet above the frozen, patchwork fields of northern Germany. The cold was a living thing at this altitude. A 40 below zero monster that seeped through the electrically heated sheepskin of his suit, numbing flesh and hardening breath into ice crystals on the rim of his oxygen mask. His world was a perspex and steel bubble at the very aft end of the bomber. A solitary confinement cell with a panoramic view of hell. He was the tail gunner. The loneliest man on the plane. 40 feet of dim, balm, bay cavern separated him from the nearest living soul. His only company was the pair of heavy, oiled M2 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns he cradled, their brutal mechanisms his sole connection to the fight, to survival, to impacting the swirling, lethal dance outside his windows. And right now, that dance had reached a crescendo. The German fighters, Messerschmitts and Foch, Wolfs, the angular, predatory shapes he'd memorized from recognition posters, were finishing their work. They'd shot the engines, they'd silenced the other guns, and now they were dismantling the fortress piece by piece. Moran, Lout, a 19-year-old farm boy from the rolling dairy hills outside Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, had been firing until his gloves smoked. The spent brass from his twin Brownings lay ankle deep around his boots, Lout, a glittering, metallic testament to his defiance. His arms, both shattered by 20 Namur cannon rounds just minutes before, Lout, screamed with a pain so intense it had become a kind of white noise, a background hum to the catastrophe. Blood, his blood, Lout, was frozen in dark, sticky rivulets across his chest plate and the sleeves of his flight jacket. Lout, he could no longer feel his fingers, but some deep, stubborn circuit between his brain and his hands remained closed. He could still will the guns to fire, and then came that sound. Not an explosion, but a deep, groaning rent, Lout, as if God had taken a fingernail to the tin can sky. The fuselage directly in front of his position, Lout, the point where his tiny sanctuary joined the rest of the aircraft, simply parted. Through the swirling chaos of smoke, freezing slipstream, and tracer smoke, Eugene Moran saw a sight no airman was ever meant to witness. He saw the front of his airplane, the entire nose section, the cockpit where the pilot and co-pilot sat, or had been sitting. He knew they were gone. The plexiglass bombardier station, the wings with their two remaining feathered engineers, all of it, silently and majestically, began to drift away from him. It was like watching a ship break in half on a terrible aerial sea. It didn't plummet. At first, it just separated, a slow motion ballad of destruction against the hard, pale blue of the high-altitude sky. For a surreal, weightless second, he saw the silhouette of the B-17, his B-17 decapitated. He saw the cross-section of the ripped fuselage, the jagged edges of aluminum skin curling inward like a peeled banana. He saw the dark, rectangular shapes of the bomb bay, now empty. And then gravity, patient and inexorable, reasserted its claim, the forward section out. Carrying with it the bodies of 8 of his crewmates, began to roll. It pitched forward, nose down, and started its long, final dive toward the earth 4 miles below. It shrank with terrifying speed out, transforming from a wounded warbird into a tiny, smoking cruciform speck, and then was swallowed by the cloud layer. Eugene Moran was now alone. Not just alone in his position, he was alone in a severed tail section of a B-17, a twisted metal coffin roughly the size of a small car, hurtling through the sky at terminal velocity. The slipstream, howling, through the ragged wound where the plane had torn open, threatened to suck him out into the void. He braced his broken arms against the gun mounts, the pain flaring anew, and looked down. The German countryside, a serene mosaic of forest and field from the safety of formation just minutes ago, now rushed up at him with a dreadful, zooming clarity. He was falling. He had no parachute out. The same cannon burst that mangled his arms had shredded his chest, packed chute into useless silk confetti. The mathematics were simple, brutal, and absolute. Terminal velocity for a human body is about 120 miles per hour. The tail section of a B-17, with its heavy spars, armor plate, and gun mechanisms, falls considerably faster. He had perhaps 90 seconds to live, 90 seconds until impact with the frozen German earth. A 4-mile drop. No parachute. 2 broken arms. A head wound he could feel leaking warmth into his icy helmet. This was the end, lout. This was the moment every gunner in the 8th Air Force secretly imagined in the dark, silent moments before a mission. The inescapable finale. But Eugene Moran did not close his eyes. He did not pray. He did not think of the farm in Wisconsin, or his mother, or the girl back home. In that splinter of time, as his shattered world tumbled end over end through the freezing sky, his mind achieved a preternatural, furious clarity. It focused on one thing, and one thing only: the machine guns. They were still there, mounted to their frame belts of .50 caliber ammunition still feeding into the receivers. The German fighters, the ones who had done this, were still out there. He could see them, circling like sharks, watching their kill fall, confirming their victory. A cold rage, purer and sharper than the Arctic air, cut through the pain and the terror. It wasn't about survival anymore. That equation had been solved. It was about defiance. It was about answering the violence of the sky with one last, irrevocable act of will. If he was going to die, when he was going to die, he would die a gunner. He would die fighting, with a grunt that was torn from his lips by the 150-mile-per-hour wind. He used his elbows and the remnants of his strength to swing the left Browning toward the blurred shape of a fawk wolf that had drifted too close. Curious about the tumbling wreckage, his numb, shattered hands found the triggers out. He leaned his forehead against the icy gun sight, a gesture of intimacy with the weapon out. And as the torn tail section spun violently, presenting him with a dizzying, whirling view of sky, ground, he fired. The hammering report of the .50 caliber was swallowed by the howl of the wind, but the bright, angry stream of tracer rounds arsed out into the void. They went wild, scribbling insane geometries in the air, a firework display of futile fury. The German pilot, startled, banked sharply away. He hadn't expected that. No one expected a man in a falling coffin to shoot back. Moran's world was a violent gyroscope. He was weightless, loud, then crushed against his seat by G-forces, then slammed into the ceiling of the broken fuselage. The tail section was tumbling, not just falling, spinning along its long axis, pitching and yawing out. Through the cracked perspex, the ground alternated with the sky in a sickening, accelerating blur. The forest below grew larger, its individual trees beginning to resolve from a green smear into distinct, spear-like pines out. The pain in his arms was a distant throb now, secondary to the overwhelming vestibular nightmare of the spin. He was going to be sick. He was going to black out, but he held on. To the guns. To the rage. He fired another burst. A short 3-second chatter, as a Messerschmitt flashed through his view. He didn't lead it, couldn't lead it. The shot was pure instinct, a predator's snap at a passing shadow. The rounds missed by a mile. Vapor trails dissipating into the cold blue. Yet the act itself was everything. Each squeeze of the trigger was a denial. A refusal to accept the narrative the sky, the Germans, and physics itself had written for him. "You are a dead man." The universe screamed at him as he spun. "You are already dead." And with every convulsive burst from his Brownings, Eugene Moran, the Wisconsin farm boy, the tail gunner, screamed back, "Not yet." The altimeter on the bulkhead was shattered, its glass gone, needle bent. He didn't need it. The pressure in his ears, the terrifying clarity of the landscape, the sheer speed of the visual feed, he knew he was through 10,000 feet, maybe lower. Time, which had dilated to a crawl in those first seconds of the fall, now began to accelerate, rushing toward the 0 point. Loud. The ground wasn't approaching anymore, it was exploding upward to meet him. The forest was a bed of green spikes, a frozen river a silver scar, a church steeple in a distant village, a tiny, absurd detail. And then something changed. A buffet, a shudder. The violent spinning began to slow. The tumbling chaos started to smooth into a steeped, whistling descent. The aerodynamic shape of the tail section, the massive vertical stabilizer fin and the horizontal stabilizers, were finally catching the thicker, lower altitude air. They were acting like a crude, terrible wing. The wreckage wasn't flying, not by any definition a pilot would recognize. But it was no longer tumbling out of control. It was gliding, angrily, awkwardly, but indisputably out. Its fall was slowing from a sheer, headlong plummet to a deadly, but slightly more controlled, dive. For the first time since the breakup, Moran had a semi-stable view. He was facing forward, down the long axis of what was left of his aircraft. The wind shrieked through the open wound out. The ground filled his entire field of vision. He could see individual fields, the lines between them like seams on a quilt. He could see a road, a cart track. He could see the dark, triangular shadows cast by the pine trees in the late morning sun. The sensation was surreal. He was piloting this piece of wreckage, not with controls, but with its very shape. It was sliding earthward on a colossal, invisible ramp of air. The German fighters were gone. Whether startled by his last bursts of fire, or simply convinced their work was done, they had peeled away, their contrails fading into the high sky where the battle still raged. He was alone with the wind and the earth. The pain rushed back in, a tsunami of agony from his arms, his head, his ribs. The adrenaline that had fueled his defiance was burning off, leaving behind a terrifying, crystal clear awareness of his situation. He was going to hit the ground. Very, very soon. He had perhaps 30 seconds. There were no procedures for this. No chapter in the manual titled, "How to Crash, Land a Severed B-17 Tail Section." His mind, that sharp farm boy mind that could calculate wind drift on a .50 caliber round, now scanned the rushing landscape with a frantic, analytical precision. He was heading directly for a dense stand of pine forest. The trees were tall, maybe 80, 100 feet out. Hitting the thick trunk of one would be like hitting a concrete pillar at 100 miles an hour. Instant, obliterating death, but the spaces between the trees, the canopy. His brain made a desperate, wild calculation. The pines had branches, lots of them, a dense, layered net of wood and needle. If he could hit the top of the canopy at a shallow angle, maybe, just maybe, it would shred the wreckage, sap its momentum, slow it down before it struck the ground. It was a 1 in a billion chance. It was the only chance he had. He did the only thing he could do. He braced. He wedged his boots against the ammunition cans. Loud. He pushed his back as hard as he could into the solid steel of the armor plate behind his seat. He tucked his chin down, trying to protect his neck. He wrapped his shattered arms, screaming in protest, around the gun mounts out, using them as anchor points. He took one last, deep, burning breath of the thin, cold air, tasting oil and cordite and blood, and he looked straight ahead. Out. The first branches of the tallest pine tree arrived with the subtlety of a freight train. A green, black blur filled the world outside the perspex, followed instantly by a deafening, splintering CRSK WWII loud. The tail section didn't so much hit the tree as it ate it. The left horizontal stabilizer sheared off completely out, spinning away into the forest like a giant, crazed throwing star. The wreckage lurched violently to the right, and Moran's body was thrown like a rag doll against his restraints, his head snapping forward, and then back with a whiplash crack he felt in his teeth. Then came a continuous, grinding out, tearing cacophony. They were inside the canopy now. Branches, some as thick as a man's thigh, smashed against the fuselage out, caving in the thin aluminum skin, punching through like monstrous fists. The remaining perspex windows blew inward in a shower of lethal, crystalline confetti. The world became a frenzied out. Chaotic tunnel of snapping wood, whipping green needles, and the ear-splitting scream of metal being disassembled by force out. The tail section was cartwheeling, tumbling again, but slower now out, its energy being brutally stolen by the relentless lattice of the forest. Each impact was a colossal hammer blow, transferred through the frame into Moran's body. He felt his ribs go. A series of sickening, interior pops like a string of firecrackers going off in his chest. A searing hot knife of pain stabbed through his left leg. Something heavy, a radio set, maybe, out, broke loose from its mount and smashed into the back of his seat, driving the breath from his lungs out. He lost all sense of up or down. He was in a washing machine filled with timber and sheet metal. The noise was beyond comprehension, a physical force. He was sure he was screaming, but he couldn't hear his own voice. His vision flickered, a strobe light of green darkness, splintered daylight, and swirling debris. And then, with one final, colossal THUMP that drove the breath from his body in a final, agonized gasp, the motion stopped. The silence was the most shocking thing of all. It was a thick, ringing, absolute silence, broken only by the faint, pathetic tink, tink, tink of hot metal cooling somewhere, and the slow, sad patter of loosened debris. Nuts, bolts, out. Bits of insulation, raining down onto something. Moran couldn't see. His eyes were open, but all he registered was a dim, hazy greenish brown. He was lying at a steep angle, still strapped into his seat, which had been torn partially from its moorings. A heavy, cloying smell filled the air. The sweet, sappy scent of crushed pine, the acrid stink of torn electrical wires, the metallic tang of fresh blood, and the pervasive, greasy odor of aviation fuel. He tried to move. Nothing happened. A distant, fuzzy signal told him he had issued a command to his right arm, but there was no response. No pain, no movement, nothing. He was a consciousness trapped in a broken vessel. He tried to breathe, and that's when the real pain announced itself. A white-hot, stabbing agony in his chest with every fractional expansion of his lungs. Broken ribs. Several of them. maybe a punctured lung. The thought floated through his hazy, "That's bad," slowly, as if his brain were booting up one damaged circuit at a time. Other sensations filtered in. A cold out. Wet feeling on the left side of his head. Not the dry cold of altitude, but a slick, sticky cold. He managed to tilt his eyes downward. A dark, crimson stream was working its way down from his hairline, over his temple, and into his collar. He could see a piece of his flight helmet, torn clean off, dangling from a wire next to his face. And he could see something else, something that shouldn't be visible. Through the matted blood and hair, he could see a pale, glistening white curve. It took his oxygen-starved mind a long, terrible moment to process what it was. Bone, his own skull, out. A section of it, about the size of a silver dollar, had been torn away, out, sheared off by a piece of debris or a branch during the crash. His brain was partially exposed to the freezing German air. A strange detachment settled over him. So that's what it looks like, he thought, with an almost academic curiosity. The panic, the terror of the fall, was gone. In its place was a profound, wary exhaustion and this eerie, observant calm out. He was critically, catastrophically wounded. He was in the middle of a German forest, deep inside enemy territory, just miles from a city, Bremen, that he and his squadron had just tried to bomb into rubble. He had no weapon. He couldn't move. He was bleeding out, and it was cold. The kind of cold that kills wounded men in minutes, not hours. This was it. He had cheated the 4-mile fall, only to die slowly and alone in the wreckage of his own airplane, out. The defiance that had sustained him in the air had bled out of him, leaving him empty. He closed his eyes, out. It would be easier just to let go. To let the cold and the shock do their work. He thought of his mother's kitchen, warm and smelling of bread. A stupid, simple thought. He held on to it. A sound pierced his descending lethargy. Not a forest sound, a human sound, voices. They were distant, muffled by the trees, but growing closer. German voices, shouting orders to one another. The crash had been anything but subtle. The local Volkssturm, the Home Guard, or a proper Wehrmacht patrol would be coming to investigate, to secure the crash site, to look for survivors. A new kind of fear, cold and sharp, cut through the pain haze. It wasn't the fear of death. It was the fear of capture, loud, of becoming a prisoner of war. The stories circulated among the air crews were grim. Lynch mobs from bombed out cities, beatings, executions. The Geneva Convention was a piece of paper, and this was total war. A downed American flyer out. A terrorflieger in the Nazi propaganda was a prize, and a target. The voices were closer now, loud. He could hear the crunch of boots on frozen undergrowth, the snap of twigs. They were methodical, sweeping the area. He was utterly helpless. He couldn't run. He could barely breathe. All he could do was lie there, in his metal and pine coffin, and wait for the faces to appear in the jagged hole that had once been his gun position, out. The first face did appear, blocking the dim light. It was a man's face, middle-aged, pale and pinched with cold under the rim of a German army field cap. He wore a thick, gray-green greatcoat. His eyes, wide with a mixture of curiosity and grim satisfaction, met Moran's. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the hunter and the broken prey. The German's gaze took in the incredible scene, the tiny, shredded compartment out. The deep carpet of spent shell casings, the young American soaked in his own blood, his head injury glaringly obvious. The German soldier didn't smile. He didn't snarl. He just looked out, his breath making small plumes in the cold air inside the wreck. Then he called over his shoulder, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. "Here, einer let noch. Here, one is still alive." The soldier's words, "Here, einer let noch," hung in the frigid air, a death sentence wrapped in plain statement. More boots crunched, and soon the broken opening of the tail section was crowded with faces. Young, old, all wearing variations of the same grim winter, pale expression. They were a mixture, Moran's fading consciousness registered. Some proper soldiers with rifles, flout. Older men from the local home guard with armbands. And a couple of boys who couldn't have been more than 16. Their eyes wide as they stared at the bloody apparition before them. No one moved to help him. They simply looked out, a silent gallery assessing the ruin of man and machine. Moran tried to meet their gaze to summon some last shred of defiance, but all he could manage was a slow blink. The pain was a high-pitched, constant whine in every part of his being, and the cold from the forest floor was seeping up through the metal, leaching the last remnants of his body heat. He was shivering violently now, a full-body tremor that made the agony in his ribs and arms blossom into fresh, white, hot blooms. An older man, an officer by the look of his cap, and the rigid set of his shoulders, pushed through the onlookers. He peered out, his eyes sharp and analytical, sweeping over the instruments, the guns, finally landing on Moran. His lips pressed into a thin line. He barked an order. Two of the younger soldiers, looking reluctant, clambered into the wreckage. The space was tiny, cramped with debris. They had to move carefully. Their hands were not gentle. They were rough, efficient, devoid of malice, but also of any compassion. This was a piece of battlefield salvage. One of them grabbed Moran under his shattered arms to haul him out. The moment the pressure hit the compound fractures, a black, consuming wave of agony swallowed Moran whole. A guttural scream, raw and animal, tore from his throat, echoing briefly in the shattered fuselage before the forest absorbed it. The soldier flinched, but didn't let go. The other man grabbed his legs, and together they dragged him, loud, bumping and scraping over torn aluminum edges and splintered wood, out of the tail section and into the open air. The world tilted and spun. The gray German sky wheeled above the dark spear points of the pines. They dumped him unceremoniously onto the frozen, needle-strewn ground. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs out, and for a terrifying moment, he couldn't draw breath, his broken ribs locking in a vise of pain. He lay gasping like a fish on a bank, his open skull wound pressing into the icy dirt. The officer stood over him, looking down. He said something in rapid German that Moran didn't understand. A soldier knelt out, his hands patting down Moran's flight suit. He found his dog tags, yanked them from around his neck out, the chain biting into the back of his neck before snapping. He handed them to the officer. He found a .45 pistol Moran had never had a chance to draw, tucked in its shoulder holster. This was taken. He found his wallet, a few damp, useless dollars, a photograph of his parents. These were examined, shrugged out, and stuffed into the officer's coat pocket. Then the soldier's hands found the parachute pack, still strapped to his chest. He unbuckled it, pulled it away, and held it up. The officer took it, fingering the multiple clean bullet holes and rips that dotted the silk. He looked from the ruined chute to Moran's bloody head out, to the impossibly wrecked tail section wedged in the trees 30 feet above them. a flicker of something. Not respect, but a kind of cold, professional astonishment passed behind his eyes. He grunted, said, "Ungloblich," out, and tossed the parachute pack aside into the brush. They left him lying there. For how long, Moran couldn't tell, Lout. Time had become liquid, pooling and dripping. He drifted in and out of a gray, pain-filled stupor, Lout. The soldiers busied themselves around the crash site. He could hear them hacking at the wreckage with axes, Lout, presumably to retrieve the machine guns or any useful equipment. He heard the crackle of a field radio, static spattered German sentences reporting the location, the capture of one survivor. The words, "Schwerverwundet," were used repeatedly. Eventually, they came back for him. There was no stretcher. No medical kit was opened, out. Two soldiers simply grabbed the shoulders of his flight suit and his boots and began to drag him through the forest. It was a form of torture beyond any devised in hell. Every root, every rock, every frozen rut in the ground sent jolts of sheer, unadulterated agony through his shattered body, out. His broken arms flopped uselessly, snagging on branches, the bones grinding. He couldn't scream anymore. He had no breath left for it. All that came out were wet, choked whimpers. Tears of pure, helpless pain froze on his cheeks. Out. The world narrowed to a tunnel of pine trunks passing overhead, the rhythmic, grunting breaths of the men dragging him, Lout, and the all-consuming fire in his bones. They reached a cart track. A simple, horse-drawn wooden farm cart waited there, out. The old mare hitched to it, stamping its feet and blowing steam. Without ceremony, they lifted him. Another explosion of pain, and dumped him into the bed of the cart. The wood was hard, unforgiving, and gritty with dried mud and manure. They threw a rough, sour-smelling horse blanket over him, not for warmth, he realized, Lout, but to conceal him from any prying eyes on the road. The officer said a few more words, the cart driver, out. An elderly civilian with a face like wrinkled leather nodded silently, clicked his tongue, Lout. And the cart lurched into motion. Each turn of the wooden wheels was a fresh calamity. The cart had no suspension. Every pebble, every dip in the frozen road transmitted directly through the planks into his destroyed skeleton. The journey became an endless, jolting continuum of suffering. He faded in and out, sometimes conscious of the gray sky, the bare branches of trees lining the road, the occasional glimpse of a stone farmhouse, other times lost in feverish, out. Broken dreams of the fall, the spinning sky, the chatter of his guns. He was taken to a building. It might have been a school once, or a town hall. Now it had the grim, utilitarian feel of a military outpost. German soldiers milled about. He was carried inside, not dragged this time, Lout, but hauled by his armpits and ankles by two bored-looking guards. They brought him into a room with a concrete floor, out, stained and slick with damp. The air smelled of mildew, stale tobacco, and something else. A coppery, Lout, unclean smell he would later recognize as the scent of a place where hopeless men are brought. They propped him in a sitting position against a cold, plaster wall. His head lolled forward, his chin on his chest. He could not hold it up. He sat there, in a pool of his own blood and melting frost from his flight suit, and waited. Men walked past. Boots clicked on the concrete. No one spoke to him, out. He was a piece of debris that had momentarily inconvenienced the machinery of war. His wounds were a fact, not a crisis. He was an enemy airman, a Terrorflieger, and he was dying. The most efficient solution was to let the process finish itself. Hours passed. or maybe it was only minutes. The chill of the concrete seeped into him, a deep core cold that slowed his heart and thickened his blood. The pain began to recede, not because it was lessening out, but because his body was shutting down, withdrawing from the unbearable stimuli. This was the cold sleep out, the hypothermic prelude to the end. He thought of his crew. Jesse Orison, the navigator. Had he gotten out? Were any of them, against all odds, alive? He would never know. A profound loneliness, deeper than any he felt in the tail gunner's bubble, enveloped him. He was going to die alone, unnamed, in a dirty room in Germany. But something stubborn, a tiny, guttering pilot light in the furnace of his spirit, refused to go out. It was the same ember that had made him fire his guns on the way down. It wasn't courage, not exactly. It was simpler, more primal out. It was the instinct of the farm boy who had seen newborn calves struggle to their feet in the icy dawn. It was life, insisting on itself. Not yet, it whispered, against the dying of the light. Not like this. He must have lost consciousness, because the next thing he knew, a new sound was cutting through the fog. A different kind of voice. Not German. The words were guttural Slavic. He forced his eyes open a slit. Two men in shabby, fitting uniforms that were neither American nor German were kneeling beside him. They wore armbands with a red cross, but their insignia was unfamiliar. One was older, with a lined, wary face and intelligent, sad eyes. The other was younger, out. Intense. They were talking softly to each other, ignoring the German guard who leaned against the doorway, out. Watching with idle disinterest. The older man's hands, surprisingly gentle, were probing his head wound. Moran flinched, out. A weak, spasmodic jerk. The man murmured something, not in English, but the tone was calming, professional, out. He examined Moran's arms, his fingers deftly feeling the grotesque angles of the fractures through the flight suit material. He looked into Moran's eyes, checking his pupils with a small flashlight produced from a battered medical kit, out. He then turned and spoke to the German guard in halting, heavily accented German. The guard shrugged, out, said something short and dismissive, and gestured vaguely with his rifle. The older man's shoulders slumped slightly, but he nodded. He turned back to his younger companion, and they began a quiet, urgent conversation. These men, Moran would later learn, were Serbian doctors, captured military physicians from the Royal Yugoslav Army, out. They had been pressed into service by the Germans to tend to prisoners of war, out. A cynical move that freed up German medical staff for their own wounded. They worked with almost no supplies, out. Under constant supervision, in conditions that would break most men. They were slaves with stethoscopes. The older doctor, his name was Alexander, looked back at Moran. In broken, painfully assembled English, he said, "You fall." From sky. Moran, with an immense effort, managed the tiniest nod. A shadow of awe passed over the doctor's face. Loud. He said something in Serbian to his colleague, who crossed himself. Then, Alexander's expression hardened into one of grim determination. He looked at the German guard, then back at Moran's ruined body. He leaned close so his words were a breath in Moran's ear. "We try. We help. You understand. But very bad." He pointed to Moran's head, his arms, his chest. "Surgery. Now, no medicine. No sleep medicine. You be strong." Yes, Moran didn't have the strength to answer, but he held the doctor's gaze. He let the man see the faint, stubborn light that was still there. Alexander gave a single, firm nod. He stood and began barking orders in Serbian, The younger doctor rushed out, presumably to gather what passed for surgical tools. The German guard, looking vaguely annoyed at the activity, shifted his weight but didn't interfere. As long as these doctors were busy with this hopeless case, they weren't causing trouble. What followed was not surgery as the modern world understands it. It was a 7-hour marathon of butchery and miracle performed in a converted storage room with instruments that were little more than crude steel tools. There was no anesthesia. A local numbing agent, weak and largely ineffective, was injected around the wound sites, but it did little to blunt the reality of what was happening. They started with his head. Moran was laid on a wooden table, his head stabilized on a rolled-up blanket. He was fully, horrifyingly conscious. He felt the tugging as they cut away his matted hair and flight suit collar. He felt the cold steel of a probe exploring the edges of the hole in his skull. Then came the scraping. The sound, a gritty, high-pitched screech as a medical rasp scraped against his own living skull bone, would haunt him for the rest of his days. They were cleaning the wound, removing tiny bone fragments, trying to prevent infection in the brain tissue itself. The pain was a bright, electric wire threaded directly into the core of his being. He bit down on a leather strap until his jaw ached, his body rigid, sweat pouring from him despite the cold. The younger doctor held a kerosene lamp close, the flickering light casting monstrous, dancing shadows on the walls. Alexander worked with a terrifying, focused calm, using pliers and wire cutters that had probably been used to fix farm equipment. He fashioned a crude plate from a piece of thin, salvageable aluminum from a mess kit. He sterilized it in a flame until it glowed red, then let it cool in boiled water. This rough, 5-sided piece of metal was to be his new skull. With delicate, precise movements that belied the crudeness of his tools, Alexander fitted the plate over the exposed brain using fine wire, like the kind used for stitching mail sacks, to suture it to the remaining edges of Moran's own skull. Each twist of the wire was a tiny, piercing agony. Then they moved to his arms. Both forearms were compound fractures. The bone had broken the skin. Infection had already set in, the flesh around the wounds an angry, swollen purple. Gangrene was a real and present danger. Without antibiotics, amputation was the usual solution. But amputation required more resources, more recovery time. And in a POW camp, a double amputee was a dead man walking. Alexander chose a different, even more brutal path. He would try to save the arms. It meant open surgery to clean the wounds of debris and dead tissue, set the bones and hope the body could fight off the infection. The younger doctor administered a few precious drops of morphine from a nearly empty syringe. It took the edge off, but only just. Moran felt the scalpel cut into the flesh of his forearm. He felt the pressure as the doctor manipulated the broken ends of the radius and ulna, trying to align them. He felt the grating vibration as a small hand drill was used to bore holes in the bone fragments. Then came the wires threaded through the holes, pulling the pieces together, cinched tight. It was carpentry on a living subject. The pain was so vast, so comprehensive, that Moran's mind finally, mercifully, detached. He floated above the table, watching the two haggard men in their stained coats work under the poor light, their faces masks of concentration and exhaustion. He felt a distant, academic appreciation for their skill. They splinted the arms with strips of wood torn from a packing crate, bandaging them tightly with clean-ish linen that had been boiled. They wrapped his ribs tightly to stabilize them. When it was finally over, they washed him with cold water, covered him with a thin, scratchy blanket, and placed him on a pallet of straw in a corner of the room. Alexander knelt beside him, his own hands trembling slightly from the ordeal. His English failed him. He simply placed a hand on Moran's good shoulder, looked him in the eye, and shook his head slowly, a gesture that spoke volumes. "I have done all I can. The rest is up to you and God." The fever came that night. It rode in on a wave of fire, burning him up from the inside. The infections, despite the doctor's brutal cleaning, had taken hold in his bloodstream. Sepsis. In 1943, even in the best hospitals, sepsis was a coin toss. In a pedo clearing station, it was a death sentence. For 3 days and nights, Eugene Moran hovered in a liminal space between life and death. The fever cooked his brain. He raved, shouting orders to dead crewmates, crying out for his mother, reliving the fall and the crash over and over in a continuous, hellish loop. The Serbian doctors took turns sitting with him, placing cold, wet cloths on his forehead, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. They had no sulfa drugs, no penicillin. All they had was basic nursing care and a stubborn refusal to let this particular miracle die on their watch. The German guards checked in occasionally, looked at the delirious, wasted American, and shrugged. Loud. They were just waiting for the bunk in the corner to be empty. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke out. It didn't subside gradually, it shattered like glass. One moment, Moran was burning in the core of a sun, the next he was lying in a pool of his own sweat, shivering with cold, but utterly, lucidly present. He opened his eyes. The world was in focus. He saw the cracked plaster of the ceiling, the weak winter light filtering through a high, barred window. He felt the massive, throbbing ache in his head and arms, but it was a localized pain. The systemic fire was gone. Alexander was there, dozing in a chair. Hearing Moran stir, he jolted awake, his eyes immediately going to his patient. He felt Moran's forehead, checked his pulse, peeled back an eyelid. A slow, wary, triumphant smile spread across his exhausted face. He didn't speak. He just nodded, again and again. Then he turned and called out in Serbian, his voice cracking with emotion. He had won. Against the infections, against the odds, against the indifference of the war, he had won this one small battle. The road back was measured in inches. Learning to sit up with shattered ribs. Learning to sip broth without choking. The blinding headaches from the metal plate in his skull. A constant, pounding reminder of how close he had come. His arms, though saved, were weak and twisted, the fingers stiff and clumsy. He would never have the full use of them again. After several weeks, when he could stand and shuffle a few steps, the machinery of captivity re-engaged. He was processed, photographed, a haunting image of a gaunt, hollow-eyed young man with a shaved, scarred head and crude wooden splints on his arms. His personal details were recorded. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran, tail gunner, 96th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force, shot down over Bremen. He was now, officially, a prisoner of war. His time in the relative, grim safety of the aid station was over. He was given a ragged, striped POGU uniform over his flight suit. His few remaining personal effects were taken out, and he was loaded onto a truck with other captured airmen. Their destination, the vast, sprawling system of camps known as the Stalagsluft. The prisoner, of war camps for Air Force personnel. Out. The truck rattled through the bleak, winter-locked German countryside. Moran sat huddled in the back, out, watching the world go by through the slats. The other prisoners, a mix of British and American flyers shot down in recent weeks, glanced at him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Out. His injuries were obvious. His story whispered among them. That's the guy, the one who fell. 4 miles out. They say he shot back on the way down. He didn't engage. He saved his energy, focusing on the pain. Out. On staying upright as the truck jolted. He was entering a new phase of the ordeal. Out. The battle for physical survival against his wounds was, for now, won. Now began the longer, slower, more insidious battle. The battle against despair, against starvation, against the soul, crushing weight of time in a cage. He had survived the sky's attempt to kill him. Now he had to survive the grounds. The truck passed through a series of gates, barbed wire fences rolling out to either side. Watchtowers with machine gun nests dotted the perimeter. He had arrived at WWII, his new home. A city of barracks and mud, surrounded by wire under a vast, indifferent sky. As he was marched through the compound, out, hundreds of faces peered from windows and doorways. Pale, thin faces of men in various states of captivity. Out. They looked at the new arrivals with the blank eyes of veterans assessing replacements. Moran lifted his head, out, squinting against the low winter sun. The air was sharp with the smell of coal smoke, boiled turnips, and unwashed humanity. Somewhere in the distance, a man was coughing, a deep, racking sound. This was not the end of his war. It was just a different kind of front line. And Eugene Moran, the tail gunner who refused to die, squared his shoulders, as much as his broken body would allow, and took his first shuffling steps into the crowd. The stale, crowded air of WWII held a specific kind of cold. A damp, penetrating chill that no amount of thin, gray blankets or huddling around the single, miserly stove in each barracks could truly defeat. It was the cold of inertia, of endless, unchanging days. For Eugene Moran, newly processed and assigned to a bunk in a drafty wooden hut. The shock was not the barbed wire or the guard towers, it was the sheer, loud, grinding monotony that followed the hurricane of violence he had survived. His days took on a grim, predictable rhythm. The pre-dawn appel, the roll call, where thousands of shivering men stood in rows in the frozen mud for an hour or more, out, counted and recounted by bored, barking guards. The meager breakfast, a cup of ersatz coffee, and a slice of black, sawdust-laden bread, sometimes smeared with a vile, gelatinous margarine. Then the long, empty stretch until lunch. A thin, watery soup, usually turnip or cabbage, out, in which a few precious potato fragments might be discovered like archaeological treasures. Another appel in the afternoon. More empty hours. Lights out. His body was a prison within the prison, out. The headaches from the aluminum plate in his skull were a near, constant companion. A dull, metallic throb that sharpened with changes in the weather or spikes in his blood pressure. His arms, though the bones were knitting, were weak and ached fiercely in the damp cold. The Serbian doctors had performed a miracle of salvage, but they had not restored function. He could grip a spoon, shuffle a deck of the precious, worn playing cards that circulated in the camp, out, but the fine motor control of a gunner was gone forever. His ribs, tightly bound, made every deep breath a careful, calculated effort. Yet, in this place of depletion, he found a strange community, out. The camp was a cross-section of the Allied Air Forces. British Lancaster pilots, Canadian navigators, out. Australian wireless operators, and American B-17 and B-24 crewmen from every state in the Union. They were bound together by the shared experience of the falling sky and the shared reality of the wire. Rank mattered less here, survival mattered more. Stories were the currency of the camp. Told and retold during the endless hours, a way to pass time, to remember who they were, to stave off what the men called barbed wire psychosis, a creeping mental atrophy. At first, Moran was reluctant to share his. It felt too raw, too impossible, but word had spread, as it always did in a closed community, out. Men would glance at the visible scars on his scalp, at the awkward way he held his arms, and ask in hushed tones. Eventually, he would tell it in spare, unadorned sentences. The attack, the break-up, the fall, the crash, the Serbian doctors out. He left out the part about firing his guns on the way down. It felt too much like boasting. And in this place of collective helplessness, boasting was a sin. But the story circulated anyway, gaining details and weight with each retelling. He became a minor legend, not for heroics, but for sheer, dumbfounding survival. Moran's fall was a camp folk tale, a reminder that the statistics weren't absolute, that the Reaper could sometimes miss. He learned the routines of captivity, how to trade a cigarette, priceless gold in the camp economy, for an extra ladle of soup from a sympathetic cook-out. How to carefully unravel the threads of a worn-out sock to use for darning another. How to participate in the elaborate, hidden life of the camp, the secret radios, pieced together from stolen parts and hidden in false bottoms of food tins out, that brought forbidden news from the BBC, the painstakingly dug tunnels, lout. The classes men taught on everything from calculus to Spanish to car mechanics. A desperate hold on normalcy and a bet on a future. He made friends. A lanky, wise, cracking B-24 co-pilot from Texas named Charlie, who had been shot down on his 12th mission. A quiet, intensely intelligent British navigator named Simon, who spent hours sketching intricate maps of imaginary landscapes on scrap paper. These friendships, forged in shared boredom and hunger, were deeper and more immediate than any he'd known back home. They were lifelines. The Red Cross parcels were the other lifeline. When they arrived, an irregular, glorious event. It was like Christmas. Tins of bully beef, powdered milk, chocolate, dried fruit, real coffee, cigarettes, soap. These parcels from the International Red Cross were supposed to supplement the starvation German rations. They were a taste of home, of sanity, of civilization. The men would hoard their treasures, trade them, savor them over days. A single square of chocolate could be made to last a week, melting slowly on the tongue. The cigarettes were not just for smoking, they were money, medicine, comfort. But the parcels were unreliable. As the war turned against Germany in 1944, as the Allied bomber streams grew larger and the fronts drew closer, the parcels came less and less frequently. The German guards, themselves on shrinking rations, grew more surly, more brutal. The food in the camp kitchens grew thinner, the bread darker. The men's weight, already low, began to drop further. Cheekbones grew sharper, eyes more sunken. A persistent, wary weakness settled into Moran's bones, different from the pain of his injuries. This was the hunger. And then, in the summer of 1944, the rumors began. The Russians were advancing from the east. Great, sweeping victories. The camp administration grew visibly nervous. New rules were posted. more frequent, aggressive searches. The climate of the camp shifted from one of bored endurance to one of anxious anticipation. Something was coming. In July, the something arrived. They were roused in the middle of the night, barking guards flooding the barracks, flashlight beams cutting through the dark. "Raus! Als packen! Schnell! Out! Pack everything! Quickly!" Confusion reigned. They were being moved. But why? Where? The rumor mill went into overdrive. They were being taken to a death camp. They were being moved farther from the advancing Russians, to be used as human shields. They were being relocated to a central camp. No one knew. They were given minutes to gather their pitiful belongings. A spoon, a cup, a spare shirt, a precious book. Then they were herded out into the compound, formed into ragged columns. Moran shuffled into line next to Charlie. "What in the hell is this, Gene?" Charlie muttered, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a cold fear. "March." A guard snarled, overhearing. "You march. West." They were marched out of the gates of Stalag Luft IV, as the first gray light of dawn tinged the sky. They were not put on trains. They were made to walk. Columns of ragged, underfed men, hundreds of them, stretching down the country road, flanked by armed guards with dogs. This was no orderly transfer. This was an evacuation, a panicked retreat. And they were the baggage. The first day was a nightmare of disorganization and exhaustion. They walked for 12 hours with only a single 10-minute break. Their feet, unaccustomed to such use, blistered and bled. Men who were already weak from hunger and confinement began to falter. Moran's body, with its catalogue of injuries, protested every step. His ribs ached with each jolt, his head throbbed in time with his heartbeat. But he kept moving, placing one foot in front of the other, a grim mantra in his mind. "You fell 4 miles. You can walk." They slept that night in a farmer's field, under a drizzling rain, with no shelter. The guards took the barn. The prisoners huddled together for warmth, shivering in the wet grass. The rations for the day had been a single slice of bread and a cup of watery soup at noon. Moran felt the hunger as a sharp, hollow claw in his gut. The next day was the same, and the next. They were walking west, away from the distant, hopeful thunder of the Russian artillery. The guards grew increasingly nervous and short-tempered. Stragglers were not tolerated. A British flyer, weakened by dysentery, stumbled and fell. He tried to get up, his legs buckling. A guard shouted at him. When he didn't rise fast enough, the guard raised his rifle butt. Charlie, ahead of Moran, started to turn back. "Don't," Moran hissed, grabbing his arm. They watched, helpless, as the guard brought the rifle butt down on the man's back once, twice. The man crumpled, sobbing. 2 other prisoners were ordered to drag him to the side of the road. He was left there, in the mud. Whether he was shot or simply abandoned, they never knew. The column moved on. This was the new reality. The Black March, as it would later be known, had begun. It was not a single event, but a slow, grinding descent into a deeper circle of hell. They marched through rain, through sleet, through clinging mud. They slept in ditches, in forests, in the ruins of bombed out buildings. They ate what they could scavenge, raw sugar, beets pulled from frozen fields, rotten potatoes from a midden heap, once a hare that Charlie managed to snare with a bit of wire. Their Red Cross boots, sturdy gifts from home, fell apart. Men wrapped their feet in rags, in newspaper, in strips of blanket. Moran's world shrank to the few feet of road in front of him, the back of the man ahead out, the rhythm of his own labored breathing. The pain was a constant, but it had become background noise. Like the ever-present hunger, he existed in a state of near automatic function. Walk, rest, scavenge, sleep, walk. His mind retreated to a small, quiet place. He thought of the farm. The smell of hay in the summer barn. The weight of a full milk pail in his good hand. The warm flank of a cow. These were not memories of longing out, but mantras of stability, anchors to a world that had laws, where effort yielded results, where cold and hunger had limits out. Weeks blurred into months. The column snaked its way across Pomerania into Germany proper. They became specters, a procession of skeletal men in filthy rags out, moving through a countryside that was itself beginning to show the scars of defeat. Burned, out tanks by the roadside, refugees with carts heading in the opposite direction, the distant, growing drone of Allied aircraft in the sky by day. They were no longer just prisoners, they were witnesses to the collapse of an empire. Disease swept through the column out. Dysentery was the great scourge, weakening men already on the edge of starvation. Typhus out, carried by lice that infested their filthy clothes, began to claim lives. Men would go to sleep shivering with fever and never wake up. They would be buried in shallow graves by the roadside, or simply left where they fell. The guards, fearing infection themselves, kept their distance, becoming more like herdsmen driving sick cattle than military captors. One morning, out, Moran woke up and Charlie was burning up. His eyes were glassy, his skin hot and dry to the touch. The telltale rash of typhus was starting to bloom on his chest. "I'm all right, Gene," Charlie mumbled, trying to smile. Just a little chill. But he couldn't stand when the order to march came. Moran and Simon got under his arms, hauling him to his feet. "We're not leaving you, Tex." Moran grunted, the effort sending fire through his own damaged ribs. They half-carried, half-dragged Charlie for 2 days. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his weight becoming heavier as their own strength ebbed. On the 3rd day, as they struggled through a frozen rut, a guard stalked over. He looked at Charlie's lolling head, the rash now vivid on his neck. He pointed his rifle at Moran and Simon. "Loslassen? Let him go." Moran stared at the guard, then at Charlie's fever, flushed face. He remembered the man left by the roadside. He tightened his grip. Simon did the same. The guard's face contorted with anger. He stepped forward, reversing his rifle, raising the butt. Moran braced himself for the blow. But then another guard, an older man with a wary face, called out. He spoke rapidly to the first guard, gesturing at the sky, at the long column ahead. There was an argument. Finally, the first guard spat on the ground, glared at them, and moved on. The older guard gave them a look, not of compassion out, but of grim pragmatism, and motioned for them to keep moving. They had been granted a temporary reprieve. They found a discarded wheelbarrow that afternoon. It had a broken wheel that screeched with every rotation, but it was a miracle. They loaded Charlie into it, taking turns pushing the lopsided, squealing contraption out. It saved his life. After a week, the fever broke. Charlie was weak as a kitten, 20 pounds lighter, but alive. The bond between the 3 men was now forged in iron. The march stretched into January 1945, then February. The winter was the cruelest in European memory. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero. Men froze to death in their sleep out. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Moran saw a man's boots literally frozen to his feet, the flesh coming away with the leather when they were finally cut off. They marched through blizzards, the wind driving needle, sharp ice crystals into their faces. The world was a monochrome hell of white and gray. Moran's own body was failing, The constant cold made the metal plate in his head feel like a block of ice welded to his brain, The headaches became migraines of blinding intensity. His broken arms ached deep in the marrow. The hunger was now a permanent, hollow presence. He guessed he weighed less than 100 pounds. He was a walking collection of scars and old pains, held together by willpower and the stubborn, farm boy refusal to quit. One night, huddled with Charlie and Simon in the lee of a stone wall as a blizzard howled, Charlie said, his teeth chattering, "You know, Jane, back in the camp, we used to talk about your fall. Like it was the worst thing that could happen to a guy." He laughed, a dry, crackling sound. "Hell, I'd take that fall over this march any day. At least it was over quick." Moran didn't answer. He looked up at the snow swirling in the black sky. He thought of the fall, the silence after the crash. In a strange way, Charlie was right. This was a different kind of death, a slow, incremental dismantling of the body and spirit. The fall was a violent, spectacular argument with physics. This march was a whispered, endless negotiation with despair. But he was still here. He was still breathing. The column, though diminished by hundreds, was still moving west. The sound of artillery was different now. It came not just from the east, but from the west as well. A deep, continuous rumble on the horizon, like approaching thunder. The guards heard it too. Their nervousness curdled into something like panic. The orders became more erratic, the punishments more savage. They were running out of road. In early April 1945, after 86 days and nearly 600 miles of walking, the column stumbled into a situation of pure chaos. They were in a region of low hills and sparse forest. The roads were clogged not with refugees, but with retreating German troops. Disorganized, demoralized units mixed with broken, down vehicles and panicked officers. The sound of gunfire was close, small arms fire, not just artillery. The guards tried to keep them moving, but their control was unraveling. One afternoon, fallout as they were being hurried down a sunken lane, a sharp crack echoed, and a guard at the head of the column spun and fell. Then another. Confusion erupted. Shouts in German and English. The prisoners scattered, diving into ditches behind trees. Moran, Charlie, and Simon flattened themselves behind a fallen log. A firefight was raging around them. Bullets snapping through the branches overhead. They had marched straight into the front lines. For an hour, they lay there, pressed into the cold earth, as the battle swirled around them. They heard American voices. Hard, confident shouts. "Move up! Flank that machine gun!" The sound of a Sherman tank's engine grinding closer. The German return fire grew sporadic, then ceased. Cautiously, Moran raised his head. Through the smoke and early spring leaves, he saw men in uniforms he had dreamed of for 17 months. Olive drab. Helmets with a familiar eagle, globe, and anchor insignia. No, different. It was the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves. American soldiers were moving through the woods, carefully, weapons at the ready. A young GI, his face smeared with dirt, stepped over the log. He looked down at the three emaciated, filthy, wild-eyed men in striped rags huddled there. His expression cycled from combat, ready alertness to confusion to dawning, horrified understanding. He lowered his rifle. "Holy Christ," he breathed. What are you guys?" Moran looked up at him. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry out. His voice gone from Dessous. He simply raised one of his crooked, broken hands in a feeble wave. Charlie, ever the talker, found his voice first, a raspy whisper that carried the weight of a 600-mile march. "We're Americans," he said, out. "We're flyboys. And, buddy, you are the most beautiful sight I have ever seen in my whole damn life." The soldier stared for another second, then turned his head and yelled back over his shoulder out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Medic! Hey, Mendief! We got paws here! We got live ones!" The sound of that word, paws, spoken in an American accent, was like a key turning in a lock deep inside Eugene Moran. A door he had kept bolted for a year and a half swung open. The tension that had held his broken body together, the fierce, focused will to survive the next minute, the next hour, the next mile, simply evaporated. He didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He laid his head down on the damp, mossy wood of the log and closed his eyes. For the first time since November 29th, 1943, he felt safe. The war for him was over.